Welcome to episode 51 of Tahrir Podcast. It is the 17th of June, 2025, and my guest today is Professor Vali Nasr. Professor Nasr is the Majid Khadduri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, also known as SAIS, where he served as Dean from 2012 to 2019. He is also a non-resident Senior Fellow at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council. From 2009 to 2011, Professor Nasr was Senior Advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He has advised senior American policymakers, world leaders, and businesses, including the President, Secretary of State, senior members of Congress, and presidential campaigns. In episode 51 of Tahrir Podcast, we'll be discussing Professor Vali's latest book, Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History, published by Princeton University Press in late May. In it, Professor Nasr offers a sweeping account of how Iran's leaders crafted a long-term strategic vision, one shaped less by revolutionary ideology than by a deep-seated drive to preserve sovereignty, deter external threats, and assert regional power. Drawing on decades of internal debates, military doctrine, and episodes of both confrontation and quiet cooperation with the West, the book traces how Iran became a state defined by national security imperatives. From the trauma of the Iran-Iraq War to its use of proxies and its complex posture towards the U.S., Professor Nasr shows how Iran's strategy has constantly adapted, but always with the goal of survival and independence. That strategy is now being tested like never before. On June 13th, Israel launched a direct military campaign inside Iran, targeting not only nuclear facilities, but also military infrastructure, proxy networks, and key symbols of state power, with many civilians documented to have been killed in the crossfire. These strikes represent a major escalation and a sharp break from the past deterrence patterns, posing a serious challenge to Iran's strategic doctrine and internal stability. What happens next could reshape the Middle East. In our conversation, we'll explore how Iran sees its place in the world, how it balances internal tensions with external threats, and whether its grand strategy is built to withstand this new phase of regional upheaval. Please consider subscribing to the podcast on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. Support one of Egypt's remaining independent media platforms. Support Tahrir Podcast. This episode is supported by the Arab Political Science Network. Welcome on Tahrir Podcast, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to be with you.
Of course. So before we get into it, what made you write this book?
Well, I've been working on this for a number of years. And of course, there's a lot of conversation about Iran. Now it's about the nuclear issue, confrontation with Israel. Before that was the axis of resistance. Before that was Iran's general hostility to the United States. And there's always an assumption that this is all explained by theocracy and the earlier decades of revolutionary ideology, particularly in the Arab world. I still hear Iran wants to export its revolution, and that basically export things. And I've found this largely to be off the mark, that Iran is actually not interested in exporting its revolution. It definitely wants influence, but that's a very different thing. Secondly, it's very clear that Iran, to me, was very clear that Iran is not driven by ideology or theocracy here. In fact, it was very clear that Iran's supreme leader does not really see himself as a cleric as much as he sees himself as a commander-in-chief of a military, of the Revolutionary Guard. So there is a rationality, if you would, to Iran's decision-making. Rationality, I don't mean that it's a good policy, but that it's not driven by ideology, it's driven by calculation. And there are a set of assumptions to Iran's national security thinking. How does it see threat? Why does it see benefit in certain policies like supporting Hezbollah or supporting Hamas or being aggressive with Israel or with its Arab neighbors at a point in time? And I looked, if you would, to an enormous amount of material that has been published in Iran itself, war memoirs, debates. There's a trove of, if you would, national security discussion from primary sources. And I began to dig into this, into why does Iran see the world that it does? What are its national security objectives? And why does it pursue the kinds of strategies that it does? So my hope was was to shed light on how does this regime in Iran think, how does it calculate, and what is, if you would, the dominant strategic culture that is embedded in its military, in its national security decision makers is thinking.
And before we get into the main arguments, could you make clear how you operationalize or how you use the concept grand strategy in this context?
So, obviously there are different definitions of grand strategy, but by grand strategy here we mean the overarching national security objective that drives foreign policy thinking, security thinking, and ultimately has organized the fundamental institutions of the state, including its economic institutions, around achieving that goal. So, countries have small strategies for getting things done. They have tactics, they have strategies, but they have, if you want to call it, national security objectives that ultimately serve national goals. So, what are those national goals for Iran as far as they relate to its what it sees as security threats and security objectives?
And your book also emphasizes the importance of history in shaping Iran's grand strategy. So what role does history play in the development of grand strategy in revolutionary countries in general? And how is it especially significant in the case of Iran?
So I think as far as the word revolutionary goes here, is that the revolutionary state in Iran has a particular reading of history. So it still reads history, but it's how you interpret history that is embedded in it. But I think the weight of history on Iran's national security thinking is actually quite large, and that might not be different from many Arab states, right? So for Iran, there are some, I would say, fundamental facts about actually Iran as a country, but then about the history as it has learned. And then there are different interpretations of that history. So let me give you a basis that you start with. This was true of the Shah's time, and it's true of today, which is Iran sees itself as a grand civilization. And I know many in the Arab world, etc., see Iran sort of, thinking of itself as more than everybody else in the region. But I'm not saying this for see. It's a reality, and that reality is in its head. It's just like Egypt sees itself as a step above other Arab countries, as the heart of the Arab countries. It's larger, it's bigger, it was the center of culture. So this is embedded in Egypt's the way it thinks about itself. So the Iranians see themselves as a civilization. They see themselves, but at the same time, the fundamental fact here is that Iranians are alone in this region. They're alone because they are Persian speakers and they're not Arab speakers or Turkic speakers. And they are alone because their national identity is entwined with Shiism and not Sunnism, right? So they're alone on both counts. They're Shia and they're Iranian. So they're part of the Middle East, but they're also apart from the Middle East. And this loneliness is a very important driver of the anxiety of the way Iran thinks about national security. And I would argue that goes back to actually when the modern Iran was created by the Safavid dynasty in the 15th century. I mean, the Safavid basically protected Iran by adopting Shiism to separate it from the Ottoman Empire. Iran was a largely Sunni territory when the Safavids took over, and it was the Safavid Shahs that essentially forcibly converted Iran to Shiism, and they did so not out of personal conviction, but as a geopolitical choice to create that distinction. But that distinction cuts both ways. It kept Iran intact, but it also, as we saw during the Iraq War, as we saw later on in the sectarian discussions, leads to continuously say that, well, Iran is sectarian, Iran is pro-Shia, Iran is not one of us, etc. Right? So this fundamental fact is there. Then you look at, and also the fundamental fact is that these elements of its identity are pretty important to it, that is Persian and that is Shia. Then you come to 19th century, and Iran, much like Egypt, went through a century of being brutalized by imperialism. It lost territory to Russia, it lost territory to Britain, it lost Herat and Bahrain because of British meddling in Iran. It lost Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, the Caucasus, parts of Central Asia to Russia. And then all aspects of Iran's economy, etc., were deeply penetrated by imperialism. So almost like the period in Egypt after Muhammad Ali Pasha, where you had a monarchy, you technically were independent, but the British viceroy ran the place, and that has left a very, very deep imprint on Iranian psyche. And Iran almost was divided at the end of World War I between Russia and Britain. It was only saved by the fact that there was a communist revolution in Russia, and the British decided that an Iran intact was important. Then you had the rise of the Pahlavi dynasty. First Reza Shah and then the Shah. And they actually saw Iran's national security and economic development and building a strong state. And they were largely successful. And again, but in between, they were continuously interrupted. Reza Shah was forcibly removed from power by the British, and then Iran was invaded during World War II and occupied. And then when the war ended, the Soviets did not want to leave Iran. They actually wanted to take over Iran's Kurdish and Azerbaijani provinces and keep it as part of their territory. Then you had what is believed by many Iranians, American intervention in 1953 to overthrow a prime minister who was elected, Mohammad Mossadegh, who wanted to do with Iran's oil what Gamal Abdel Nasser did with the Suez Canal. Say, you're imperialist, this belongs to us. The difference was that in Suez, Americans decided that, to let Egypt keep the canal and didn't allow Britain and France to take it back. In Iran, they supported the coup to remove Mossadegh, right? I mean, my view is that the coup was not manufactured in Washington or London. It was actually manufactured in Tehran, but was supported by them because there were a lot of Iranians then, including the Shah, who thought the main threat to Iran is the Soviet Union, not Britain. But, so the Islamic Republic, and first of all, Iranians are very aware of this history of the West wanting to break Iran down, want to dominate it. Even as these bombings are happening in Iran, you hear many Iranians say, well, the objective is to destroy the country, not its nuclear program. It's to break it up. Iran is too big. They always want this. But Ayatollah Khomeini and the revolutionaries who took over Iran had looked at this history and believed that Iran for 2 centuries was struggling to be independent of imperialism, independent of America, independent of the Soviet Union. And Ayatollah Khomeini saw independence as the most important accomplishment of the revolution. In fact, he believed that Islam alone will give you independence, but the goal was independence. I mean, I start the book by saying that when the secular leftist democratic revolutionaries went to meet him in Paris in order to plan for the revolution, they gave him a proposal for a future Iranian government. And they had 2 items on the proposal, hoping to please Khomeini. And these were secular people. They said that the future government of Iran will be democratic and the future government of Iran will be Islamic. And then Khomeini wrote in his own handwriting a 3rd principle, that he will be independent. And after the revolution, a Pakistani journalist asked him, what is the most important outcome of your revolution? And he said that now all decisions will be made in Tehran. So yes, we think of the Islamic Republic as these mullahs driven by religion. But the core of it is that when it came to issues of foreign policy, national security, for Khomeini, the most important thing was that I am going to deliver Iran something that Iran had wanted for 2 centuries, to be truly independent. And they really sort of, take pride in this. I mean, if you ask yourself, what is the single biggest reason that the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, objects to giving up the right to enrichment? It's not because they want to bomb. He says the right to enrichment gives Iran energy independence. I will not give up a right that Mossadegh fought for. And the difference between me and Mossadegh, he says that Mossadegh was removed. We will stay and fight, and we will not give up the same right. And in fact, in Iran today, many on the revolutionary side talk about Iran's nuclear program in the language that Mossadegh talked about Iran's right to oil, or maybe Nasser talked about Egypt's right to Suez, right? So you can't understand the mindset. You can't understand because any idea, you start with assumptions and then you arrive at conclusions, right? So the fundamental assumptions here is that Iran must remain independent. Iran cannot be told what to do. Iran will resist the United States. Iran will remain the only country that the US cannot bully, that the US cannot dominate, right? So that mindset then gets them into the kinds of policies and outlook that we see, right? And that's why they will not compromise on many things, including the nuclear program.
And how did this way of thinking evolve over time from the 20th century up until this point?
Well, I mean, because it grows based on experiences, right? So Iran had the experiences of being occupied, almost divided, brutalized by imperialism. And then 1946, at the end of the war, the Soviets would not leave. Then 1953, the Americans intervened. And then, there are also, so Khomeini had internalized this. Now, he read history books. He was alive when Reza Shah took over Iran. He was alive when Reza Shah was removed. He was alive when the 1953 coup happened. So, he lived through all of these. It's a mistake to think that, his head was only in the Quran and the Hadith, and that's all he knew, right? If you read what he says about Israel in his book, Islamic Government, it sounds a lot like the rhetoric about Israel today. That it doesn't say his argument about being against Israel, and this is in 1970s in Najaf when he was writing, is that Israel is a colonial, settler state. It's the language is almost like the language of, occupiers at Columbia University, the student occupiers, right? So it's not a religious language. It's actually very much engaged in this conversation about anti-imperialism, etc. But then the Islamic Republic had its own experiences, right? So it's not just like what happened centuries ago or decades ago. It's also they had their own experiences. So the first experience was the taking of the American embassy and its diplomats hostage, right? Now that was planned. I believe Khomeini approved it, but the logic of it was that they were convinced that if there is an embassy in Iran, there would be a repeat of the 1953 coup. And they thought that an American embassy that's its job is to stage coups. And they were, when they saw that there was a meeting in Algiers between National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski and the moderate Democratic Prime Minister at the time, Mehdi Bazargan. So they decided that the Americans are up to something. And then when the Shah was admitted to New York, the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. They are planning against the revolution. So we should take the embassy. That basically soured relations with America in a bad way. And that became part of their thinking. That, survival of the revolution means struggle against America. This 1 + 1 = 2 for them. Then you had the Iran-Iraq war. Every leader that you see in Iran today, Ayatollah Khamenei, he was president, minister of defense, deputy minister of defense, commander of the forces during the war. And this is before they learned about how to govern. The very first lesson he learned as a new president who had not been in government before was to manage the war with Iraq. Every one of these Revolutionary Guard commanders who've been in charge, Soleimani, all of the 4 or 5 who were killed a few days ago, they were all young veterans of Iran-Iraq war. They went there when they were 17, 18, etc. And what they learned in that war became very critical, which is the whole world is against Iran. The Arabs are against Iran. The Western Europeans are against Iran. The United Nations against Iran. Everybody supported Saddam. And how did we push Saddam out of Iranian territory? We pushed it by standing on our own feet. We have to do things ourselves. We have to build our own missiles. We cannot be our own drones, our own guns, our own everything. We have to figure out how to do things ourselves. And we won our independence. I mean, you cannot discount the impact of the Iran-Iraq war on the thinking of the Revolutionary Guards. 17, 18-year-old boys who went and came out of the war with a kind of can-do-it attitude. And this idea that they won Iran's independence, they protected this territorial sovereignty against an aggressor that they believe was backed and supported by the United States. And so the lessons of the Iran-Iraq war became ingrained in the Revolutionary Guards. And you read memoirs of these generals, which I bring a lot into the book, the debates they had. It actually tells you that beyond these grand ideas of religion and anti-Americanism, practically the way they think about strategic design, military design, etc., comes out of the Iran-Iraq war. Even the idea of proxies and militias fighting in asymmetric warfare that then they replicated with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with Houthis, with the various militias in Iraq. These are all based on what they learned in the Iran-Iraq war. You cannot fight with these bigger armies backed by America with tanks and artillery and these things, right? You have to come up with a kind of military warfare that you can do yourself. Then later on we have the American invasion of Iraq, which they saw as a threat to them. In other words, America is going to come into Iraq. It's going to take over Iraq very easily, and then it's going to immediately go after Iran. And in fact, people at that time in the U.S. administration were saying this. And the U.S. was not interested in talking to Iran at the time, rejected offers of negotiations. And so the Iranians basically decided that they need to make life difficult for America in Iraq. I mean, there's a story I tell in the book that on March of 2003, just before the U.S. invaded Iran, Bashar Assad went to Tehran extremely worried. And he met with Iran's president and he met with the supreme leader. And he basically said that, after Iraq, it will be Syria and Iran's turn. And the supreme leader tells them that we have to make sure that this crocodile does not digest its food easily. So, creating militias in Iraq, the Quds force taking over Iraq, this is not ideological imperialistic. It was initially, at least, a strategy of how do you make sure that America does not succeed in Iraq in a way that think, okay, let's just go to Tehran next. And the fact that they succeeded in there, with Syrians supporting the Sunni insurgency and the Iranians supporting the Shia militias, America lost in Iraq. And that victory became a lesson for Iran. And from there, they expanded into Syria during Arab Spring, into Yemen. So I can see there is a point at which defense becomes offense. We're seeing it also with Israel. It starts with defense, then it becomes offense. And one man's defense is another man's offense. So Iran saying we're in the Arab world to defend ourselves. Then to Arabs looks like Iranian imperialism, Iranian expansionism, right? And at some points, I don't dispute that. But I would say there is a historical background to this. It's not like they woke up in the morning and say, how can we conquer the Arab world? They got themselves locked into a strategy where they said, okay, we have to be in Iraq to defend ourselves against America. And then we need to be in Syria in order to protect Iraq. Because if Assad fell, then Iraq will be indefensible. And then, and then they ended up basically creating opposition to themselves in the Arab world. becoming unpopular, and then it became a project that ultimately was not sustainable. But the logic of it was still that fundamental basics that they learned going forward.
And in light of recent escalations, particularly the strikes against Israel after October 7th, how do you evaluate Iran's actions and posture? Do you see any shifts in how Iran might handle future conflicts with Israel, and particularly the conflict that's going on right now?
Well, I think the Gaza war proved to be a very big turning point. In the first year of the Gaza war, it looked like the Iranian strategy was winning, right? In other words, the combination of Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, etc., was putting a lot of pressure on Israel. Israel had lost its deterrence. People in Israel had lost their sense of security. Israel was decimating Gaza at great cost to its international reputation, but had not either destroyed Hamas or actually released its hostages. Then in the second year of the war, all of a sudden things changed, right? First is that pager attack in Lebanon, followed by the killing of Haniya and then the killing of Nasrallah, all of a sudden turned the tables on Iran. First of all, Iran's most important proxy, Hezbollah, which had the greatest amount of power as a deterrent against Israel, fell apart. And then Iran lost its position in Syria, not because of Israel, but largely because of an operation that came out of an area that was controlled by Turkey. But end of the day, Iran lost Syria as well. But even before this happened, when Israel targeted Iran's consulate in Damascus, I believe it was April of 2023, Iran decided that Israel was no longer controlled by fear of Hezbollah, because Hezbollah was still there, but somehow Israel decided it can hit an Iranian consulate. And Iran decided that it would retaliate by missiles from its own territory. So I think that was the turning point where the idea of controlling territory, militias, etc., in the Arab world was no longer answering Iran's defense. They were facing an Israel that was no longer deterred by fear of Hezbollah missiles. And then when Hezbollah fell apart, Iran basically is now defending itself from its own territory. So it's a very different ballgame. So this presence in the Arab world no longer has the same value that it had for Iran as something that will protect them against Israel or America, right? And as we're saying, Israel is hitting Iran. Iran has not used its militias in either Yemen or in Iraq against Israel or American targets, right? It is fighting it on its own. So I think the goals are the same. Iran still wants independence, still does not want normalization with Israel or the U.S. But I think the strategy it's following is changing, and that tells you that it's not about imperialism or about ideology. It's about what works. So the Revolutionary Guard has 4 or 5 main units. The two most powerful in these terms are the Quds Force, which is in charge of the region. And then there is a division that is in charge of missiles and drones. The one which is in charge of missiles and drones has been arguing over the past year or so, forget about Quds Force. You have to give all the money to me, right? And this is not about ideology or occupying the Arab world or being an empire. It's about which of these divisions really has the best tools for defending national security. And clearly, the Quds Force is no longer, with Hezbollah gone, with Syria gone, does not have the capacity to provide that kind of protection to Iran. That doesn't mean that it should disappear. But what I'm saying is that when they're sitting around the room, although both generals are killed now, but when they're sitting around the room with the Supreme Leader making arguments about budget, strategy, etc., these are very secular conversations. It's about how do you defend the country? How do you protect it? How do you deter Israel? How do you promote your national interest? And in those terms, but you have to understand what is the objective, what are the assumptions, what are the calculations.
And so in this light, and also throughout the Islamic Republic's history, there has been a lot of tension between those who advocate for constant vigilance and a focus on defense and independence, and those who emphasize development and global engagement. So where does that balance stand today?
There have been those voices. I mean, when you think about the debate between reformists and hardliners, people like President Rafsanjani and Khatami and the Supreme Leader, or President Rouhani, who wanted a nuclear deal with the West, and the Supreme Leader, this is really about that. They are arguing something which is closer to what the Pahlavis did, that national security comes from a strong state that has strong economic development, right? Whereas, which is also the argument the Shah was making in the 1950s, that you need to be close to America and Britain, even though they were enemies, because we have a bigger enemy called the Soviet Union, and we need these European powers in order to develop. The argument of Khamenei is a lot more like Mossadegh, which is more narrow view of Iranian independence, which is we're going to assert our rights, whether that's logical or not. So we have a right to enrichment. We have a right to our own oil, right? And they are unflexible that way. So this debate has been going on, and every time the reformists have lost the debate, right? It doesn't mean that those debates are not there. And just to say that because Khamenei has anchored Iran's national security in the idea of resistance, muqawama, that's the only way to think about this. But you have to think, where does this idea of muqawama, resistance, come from? So it's historically rooted in the way he reads 19th century, 1950s, 1940s. It also has roots in how he interpreted the victory in the Iran-Iraq war. And by victory, I mean being able to get our territory back. Iran didn't get its territory back by negotiating with Saddam or by being nice to the United States. It got its territory by resistance. So this idea of resistance has historical roots, although the problem is that it's a very costly strategy that has increasingly isolated Iran. It comes at a high cost, and it also now is no longer working, right? And also the population in Iran is not the population of the 1980s, when it accepted the idea of resistance as a given. The population in Iran says that, we don't think this is working, and we don't want to pay the price for it. So you need to find something else. That's why actually the Pahlavi period is becoming so popular in Iran, because the Iranians want a normal state, I would say. A normal state that you can actually grow the economy. Why can't you grow the economy? Because we're in resistance. Well, don't be in resistance. Find another strategy. It's not that different from, when Sadat transformed Egypt, right? I mean, he made the strategic decision that Egypt's security required economic development, and economic development required peace with Israel. And the idea of war forever with Israel, even if you said in principle is something that his population wanted or many Arabs wanted, was not in the interests of the state. So I think that's the kind of debate that's raging in Iran, or has been raging in Iran for the past decade, is that the population is becoming more and more critical of resistance because it's not working and its cost is way too high, and they don't want to pay it anymore.
And before we get into this topic once more, I want you to touch on a little bit about this hardliner versus reformer within the government in the context of the nuclear aspirations. So how does that fall?
Well, I think for a very long time, Iran saw the nuclear program as a leverage to negotiate with the West to lift sanctions on Iran. Now, even thinking like this means that they saw the nuclear program essentially as a substitute for normalization. In other words, when Supreme Leader in 2015 allowed Iran to sign the deal, he didn't want that, to open an embassy and to be, shaking hands with Barack Obama on the either in Tehran or in Washington. What he wanted was that to get economic relief, economic development for Iran, but without actually normalizing relations. And he thought that the nuclear issue is big enough for Washington and for Europeans that they would agree to that kind of a bargain, right? But in time, reformers still believe that Iran needs to have relations with the West. So when you look at President Rouhani, his foreign minister, and later on Vice President Zarif, the current leadership in the government in Iran, in other words, President Pezeshkian, his foreign minister, they believe in a nuclear deal as a way of opening to the West. The Revolutionary Guards, the Supreme Leader, the Hardliners, want a much narrower deal. And then there's some of them who don't want a deal at all. They want a much narrower deal in which Iran would bargain limits to its program in exchange for certain economic freedoms. But they don't want this as a path to normalization. So, there have been no mainstream voices, or at least who have openly asked for nuclear weapons. After the Israeli attack, they are doing so much more openly. But they haven't asked for nuclear weapons. But the question is, to what extent would they open up to the West in exchange for what limits on their program? But deep down, the way they see the nuclear program is the way that Nasser saw Suez, or that Mossadegh saw oil. This is our right. Very recently, before the Israeli attack, when the president and his chief envoy, Steve Witkoff, kept saying that Iran does not have a right to enrichment, has to give it up, the Supreme Leader gave a speech in which he said, "Who the hell are you to tell us we can or cannot have enrichment?" Basically meaning, I don't recognize any outsider or the United States telling me what to do. This is a nationalist statement, which is very much a reflection of, 1950s nationalist sentiments under Mossadegh, right? It's a very anti-imperialist kind of a comment. Not to say, he didn't say, well, I understand the West's concerns, we're willing to talk it over, we're willing to, he didn't say that. He said, who the hell are you to tell me what to do as a country? Pretty much. Right? And so that sentiment is there. That's very much there, that this is our program. We're not violating any laws. We are not building a bomb. And we should have a right to it. That's why, they basically say the right to enrichment, they don't want to negotiate over, although we will see after the war what happens. But they want to negotiate because that's a fundamental national right. They call it an inherent right, especially under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they say that if we gave up that right, if we accepted that we don't have a right to enrichment, it's accepting colonial tutelage. It's a colonial dictate. Because why can Brazil have it? Why can Japan have it? Why can't Israel have it? Why can European countries have it? Why can't Iran have it? We're equal to everybody else. So that's the mindset.
And in your book, you also detail moments of Iranian-American cooperation, such as the Iran-Contra and the joint efforts against the Taliban after 9/11. And so how do these instances of collaboration fit into the broader narrative of Iran's relations with the U.S.?
None ever broke, and there's another much more famous one, which is the fight against ISIS in Iraq. Literally, you had General Soleimani on the ground with the PMF forces, the volunteers, supported by American air cover, coordinated through the Iraqi military. But the problem is that none of these instances of engagement translated into a sustained process of that would gradually reduce distrust and open the relationship. Either because America didn't want it or backed off, or because Iran didn't want it. like, for instance, the collaboration in Afghanistan was quite significant. I detail it in the book. Iran provided military support. American officials would say that they were in the room with Iranian officers, Revolutionary Guard officers, discussing targeting in Afghanistan. And they didn't know them, but some of these revolutionary officers were likely General Soleimani and General Rouhani, who would become commanders of the Quds Force. But as soon as, and then in the Bonn conference, where the United States actually was able to put together a government in Afghanistan, Iran was critical in helping forge that government. Ambassador James Dobbins was America's representative, says that every time there was a problem, I would go to Zarif, and Zarif would talk to the Afghans and find a solution. And we were able to get a coalition agreeing to a constitution and Hamid Karzai becoming a president. But no sooner than that this happened, Iran helped the United States win in Afghanistan, that Israel said that there's an Iranian ship that's been interdicted carrying weapons to Hamas. And President Bush went to the State of Union and put Iran as a part of the axis of evil. And nothing came of that collaboration in Afghanistan, right? So these things end up being episodes that none of which, was able to create a momentum that would change the direction of this relationship.
How much weight does elections and public opinion hold in the decision-making process, especially when it comes to foreign policy in these contexts?
To some extent. Elections in Iran are not fully democratic, but they're real. In other words, there are people who lose who should win. Yes, the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council decide who can run. But once they make that decision, then they cannot necessarily control the vote. And we saw that like in 1997 when President Khatami won, it was an embarrassment to the Supreme Leader. And so, yes, there are meaningful in that sense, but and they sometimes create some room for negotiations, but the power of the security forces, the hardliners, the Supreme Leader, in essentially keeping Iran's national security thinking anchored in the idea of resistance, which itself comes from the revolution, has not changed. There's not a voice in Iranian political system that can win an election that basically we said, I'm going to change Iran's foreign policy completely, right? So, there, like in the most recent presidential elections, the current president, Pezeshkian, said during the elections that Iran's economy cannot be improved without lifting sanctions, and lifting sanctions cannot happen without talking to the US, which was advocating nuclear negotiation. His opponents were saying, no, I can grow the economy by 8% without sanctions relief. And in a debate on television, Pezeshkian told him, I'm willing to step aside from the campaign and let him be president, provided that he agrees that if he doesn't grow the economy by 8%, he should be executed. And this is on national television in Iran, right? But once Pezeshkian becomes president, the latitude of what he can negotiate, how he can negotiate, what he can say is not in his hands. His government is part of a larger apparatus that is bigger than him. The Revolutionary Guards, the Supreme Leader, the judiciary, etc. So the government in Iran, which is in charge of foreign policy, is only a branch. It's not the whole thing. So the debates are there. And these debates are going to intensify. Public opinion in Iran matters. There's relatively open press. In other words, there's newspapers associated with the Revolutionary Guards, there are newspapers associated with reformists. There is a lot of activity on social media. There's a lot of talk about varieties of things. But foreign policy in Iran only veers 10 degrees this way or that way, largely because it's very much calcified under the fundamental assumptions that came out of the revolution and the Iran-Iraq war.
And looking ahead, what do you see as the key challenges or opportunities that will shape Iran's grand strategy over the next decade?
I think the most significant one is the outcome of this war with Israel. This is the most significant national security challenge since Saddam invaded Iran in September of 1980. It's the most sustained attack on the country, and it might get bigger if the United States joins and makes the war bigger. And so, how Iran fares in this, who survives, what sort of a shape the state takes afterwards, I think is going to dictate how this strategy will be revised, or whether it will be revised.
And what do you think is the likelihood or possibility of regime collapse?
I think it's there. I wouldn't say it's very high, but it's there. But you see, the problem is that what does a regime collapse into? Right? I mean, we live in the Middle East. We've seen this movie before, as they say. So yes, okay, you collapsed it into what? Okay, in Iraq, there were U.S. troops and tanks in the country. They could stand up something in its place, write a constitution. They're not very successful, but they actually could do it. But barring that, you're looking at a Libya scenario, a Syria scenario. What are we looking at, right? What does the regime actually collapse into? What does it change into? So the most likely, other than complete chaos like Libya or Syria, more than likely is that even if the current leadership in charge, falls apart, that whatever takes over is going to be from still within the same established system, right? It's not going to be, and I would say that given you're being attacked, etc., it's more than likely will be a takeover by the Revolutionary Guards. Now, what policy they follow after that, whether they be pragmatic or radical, whether they be conciliatory or rejectionist, I don't know, particularly because we've eliminated all the Israel has eliminated all the commanders that we knew. So you have a younger generation underground that is running things. I cannot say right now what their read of this moment is or how they may read it, how pragmatic they might be. But, there's not a government that's going to be falling from the sky onto Iran and taking over. It's just that's not the case.
But also, as much as the likelihood that regime collapse might be on the horizon, there's also the other possibility that this might be ultimately doing the exact opposite. So is there also a possibility that many Iranians that were against the regime would now be supporting it?
No. For the short term, they at least will not be rebelling against it. But in the long term, they may hold this foreign policy accountable for what's happened. But I don't think this is a popular vote issue here, right? So people in the end, particularly facing war, etc., are going to look for order. So like if you ask people in Gaza what they want, it's not democracy, it's food and order, right? And so then the key issue becomes who will provide it to them, who's in a position to make things work, make things open, right? And so depending on how badly this war damages Iran, how they come out of it, in what shape, then I'm sure that this war will be part of their historical experience going forward, just like Iran-Iraq war was, just like 2003 American invasion was. So what worked and what didn't work, where were they successful, where were they not, will be very important. Let's say if their missiles, end of the day, are significant enough to force Israel to agree to a ceasefire, then they're going to learn we need more of these. Their missiles prove completely useless in doing anything, they might say, okay, we might need a nuclear weapon, right? So, or they might say, look, that doesn't work either. We just need to finally give up on resistance and become something completely different. From Nasr to Sadat, from Mao to Deng Xiaoping. You could pick your own historical parallel, right? So all of these are possible, but it depends on where does this war end.
And to wrap up, you've outlined a deeply pragmatic and historically rooted view of Iran's grand strategy. So for listeners who may view Iran through a lens of ideological rigidity or revolutionary fervor, what is the key takeaway from your analysis about how Iran positions itself on the world stage?
I mean, the ideology is there. It's kind of like saying, communism was still under Gorbachev, still Soviet Union was communist. But the reality is that over time, it's not ideology that's driving what Iran does. It's ideology helps shape the way it sees the world. But it has and developed a national security doctrine that is based on secular strategic calculation. There is nationalism in there. There is, and in fact, to a greater extent today, I think the Iranian leadership sees ideology as important to national security, not national security being produced by ideology. Like they think because during the Iran-Iraq war, ideology created national unity in war. And because they believe that ideology liberated Iran from imperialism in 1979, that ideology is important for Iran's independence. Like that's the mindset of somebody like Khamenei. That's the milieu in which he grew up. That's the ideas that gave shape to that. You and I may think that it's not correct, but that's not about whether this is a good strategy. It is that if you want to see how he thinks, why is he so adamantly anti-American? Why is he so? And I'll finish by saying this: if you look at what he reads, he's extremely well versed in Western literature, in Frantz Fanon, in anti-imperialism literature of the 1960s. I mean, there's a story that Minister of Culture of Lebanon said that when Saad Hariri went to Tehran to see Khamenei, he asked them, I don't know if you've seen this story. He asked Khamenei if he would ask Hezbollah to lay down their weapons and not have their own weapons. And Khamenei said to him, have you read the Hunchback of Notre Dame? Which was fascinating. He didn't say, some Quranic thing, some hadith. He said, have you read the Hunchback of Notre Dame? And Saad Hariri hadn't read it. So here is this debonair Europe, somebody with a house in southern France, etc. He hadn't read it. And here is this Ayatollah in Iran had read it. And he told them the story of how, the main heroine of the book, Esmeralda, is a beautiful woman and everybody wants her, and how this hunchback protects her with a dagger, and that dagger is to protect Esmeralda. And he says to him at the end that the weapons of Hezbollah are the dagger of the hunchback. Lebanon is a beautiful woman, everybody wants her. So, this doesn't give you a sense of this is a man that, is driven by this sort of woolly-brained ideas of religion. Yes, he's religious. Yes, that's his background. Yes, but he has a worldview that is much larger than religious ideology. It may be wrong worldview, but you're not going to understand it by trying to understand Khamenei as a cleric. You have to understand him as somebody whose formative experiences come from the 1960s and 70s, from the era of Arab nationalism, from the era of resisting the West. Right? He's a child of that period. Anyways, thank you for inviting me. It was wonderful having this conversation with you.
Of course. Any closing remarks?
No, I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I hope the book, people who read the book will enjoy it and find it useful, at least in understanding what sort of debates and intellectual inputs goes into Iran's behavior.
Likewise, and I have no doubt. And to fellow listeners, I'll leave a link to the book in the description, and make sure to grab a copy. Thank you.
Thank you.